touched on like that, like trans women of color need to be like our kind of like our at the forefront of our priority list, right? And I think Daviel was touching on that as well. And like I think that's been like that shift seems to be happening this year with like Janet Mock and Laverne Cox being and Carmen Ferrer being so like visible and like also just being like so on point and amazing, like and it just feels like they just descended from heaven and like, articulated like are like things that are like really powerful and important. So, but you know that being said, there is like such a epidemic of violence against trans women and trans women of color, and I feel personally that is so, and I feel like you guys have articulated this as well, that is like just such an important issue for feminism and queerness, and it's like this place where we like are together or should be together, and like we're not. So like, what does that look like? How do we answer that?
I feel like like just to tie onto a point I made before and then go further, is like I feel like one way that I feel like feminism hasn't supported that is by harping on this definition of womanhood, right? So like not expanding and not understanding like what it means to identify as a woman, be feminine, and like what femininity can be. I think like a lot of gender policing and gender violence, right, what is happening to trans women of color on the street is directly tied into that, right? Like you're not seen as legitimate, as human, as woman, as deserving of respect, of deserving of love, of civil rights, and therefore you're not protected under the state, you're policed, you know what I mean? Like your body, your employment options are like close to none, you know what I mean? So I feel like in a way like supporting the community and being like, you know, you identify, like just recognizes someone else's identification is that simple, you know what I mean? Of being like, yes, this is my, you know what I mean? Like that, I feel like is one of the first steps to like addressing this issue, you know what I mean?
I think that's really great, and I'm so glad we're talking about this. And I want to look at how this state is shaping our ideas of what it means to be a woman, and how these are institutional structures that then we're also policing, but it's like the state is forming these roles of what gender is. And I think that the most important form of activism coming out of our queer communities is against the prison industrial complex and looking at how the structures of police and prisons and courts are creating systematically categories that we then police for each other.
I feel like there used to be a lot of solidarity there when like homosexuality was more criminalized, and now that there's been more assimilation, especially for like
powerful people.
Yeah. Right, exactly. Or I was more.
You know, there's like really like clear example of this we're living today. It's like you have this single enemy, you know, this word, because if we look at what's going on even just in Lakeview, like the center on Broadway, how people in the community are trying to close that center, you know. And then you look at that community, and it's, you know, it's like gay men, it's lesbian, it's straight people, but you know, it's mainly white, it's mainly from class. So like the idea that it's just one, you know, that it's like, you know, it's complicated because there's a lot of people in that neighborhood, and there's so, I mean, I think it's really, really important that something be done about that.
My dream, but I'm not a lawyer, is that I just don't think that there should be category. It's totally wrong that there should be state made categories of gender on any identification, because for me it's like that's the first offense, you know, and then that's when they start putting people into sub. Then you can legislatively oppress one over another, or over you can privilege one over the many other categories. But so if that was the like thing that we abolished, there's so many legally there's so many things that would be solved legally. I mean socially it would be a long time, but it's just like it's every day. It's like every single day I think about that. I'm just like it's like that's that's the atrocity going on of like, how can they stamp that when you're born? It's like, that's not anybody's business except, that happens in wherever. It doesn't happen at the state level. Like, what the hell, I don't know how to do it.
But I also think that we also need to look at like abolishing prisons. Like, it's not just like the ID that's going to fix the laws. It's like look at the whole structure of the prisons and the laws.
No, I totally agree, but I also just think that like how would they then organize? You know what I mean? It's like it then becomes the problem of like that. It's already like one of the hugest problems is that most of like so much of this country is not free. But I just like I feel like that's such a big. I don't know there's not even one answer to that, like how to abolish prisons. But I do know that like you just like don't have gender on a state level, like you can.
But then there would be race too.
There's always going to categorize people in prison who still exist.
I would,
No, go ahead.
Well, because I mean, this may be an aside, but because I think also when we were talking about prison abolition, and I remembered a speech that was given at TGIF, where, what's the name again? The speech given about black men and how we need to include black men in our brand awareness. Do you remember?
I'm sorry.
Okay, yeah, I'm blanking too. But there was a speech given by an elder in the community who I'm such a jerk for forgetting her name right now. Alexis Martinez. Okay, I'm such a jerk for forgetting her name. Alexis, she's great. And she was talking about how, I think the crowd got really silent, but she was like, and I'm going to get up here and just say that I don't know why we're not talking about black men right now, because black men are in prison, like, more at so-and-so rate. And, trans women of color are right there with them because they're lumped in the same cell. And, like, this is a trans woman speaking to, like, our reality as a queer and feminist community to be including black men, because at the end of the day, we're talking about power. And so, I mean, that just was reminding me, at the end of the day, we can knock down the categories, but unless we're knocking down the prisons as well, we're not doing all the work. And yeah, I just want to say that.
Yeah, and I feel like, we're experiencing violence on several different levels, but if you're talking about power and systems, like the prison industrial complex in our like society's like need for them, right? Like I don't think we can even imagine what our lives would be like without a police state. Like people love the police, people trust the police, and like that intrinsically is the problem, because so much violence that is perpetrated on our bodies, as we can name it out, is because of our dependence and our distrust of each other and our distrust of being able to like solve conflicts within our communities. So I definitely say that is like really important, especially also in terms of sex work. So you're talking about how do we, like okay, right? So like we just stated that trans women and trans people face crazy amounts of employment discrimination, right? So there's so many options at some point, and then sex work is completely criminalized and in ways that are completely ridiculous and are targeted.
Especially in Illinois, has some of the worst laws in terms of sex work. So that's important.
So it's like targeting very specific groups, and then when you hear people, especially on platforms now, talk about trans identity, right? And very often sex work is talked about in a demonizing way, similar to the mainstream gay movement talking about like I am a man, or like I am a woman, to distance themselves from like sexual deviants who are trans. You know what I mean? Like there always seems to be an us and a them. And I think it's also really important to remember, like when you're listening to that mainstream dialogue, it's like sex work shouldn't be demonized, right? It has its use, and like obviously there is like a want and a need. The problem isn't that people are sex workers. The problem is there's no protection. The problem is that people are being arrested and funneled into the prison industrial.
The problem is that they're also now within like feminist groups. A big problem is the sort of saviors of sex workers who equate human trafficking with sex work by choice, and so that's a huge problem. There's a lot of contention around that as well. So
something that's running through my mind all the time, and especially when we're talking, is that in my view, there is individual, and there is the community, and there is diversity. I think that there is diversity within ourselves too, and that's one thing. The other thing is that something that is very damaging to society in general, I think, is that inside ourselves, there is, besides diversity, there is this introjected, inside, right? There is this sense of authority and dogma and rigidity, and it is in all of us. So the question for me is how to work with ourselves against that principle that really freezes everything. And how do we acknowledge our own diversity within, right? Damaging, I think, the society is, that society in general does not acknowledge progress in a way, does not acknowledge the reality that shifts constantly, because most of the right-wing groups are, focused or stuck in the I am good, you're bad, or I have the reason, you don't. So there is this reasoning that is very authoritarian, and it goes against opening up to something that is, for me, the core, which is love, right? Love and compassion, and I feel like without that, we are constantly going to be fighting within ourselves and against the others.
Something that someone said to me recently that has been making me think about that, like human, like not always fixated on those are the people with the power, like I am powerless, right? Or like I'm attacking this one thing, that like white supremacy can exist without white people in the room. When someone said that to me, I was like, oh my God, I was at a group around like mapping desire and figuring out beauty politics and how it affects equity and like employment and like who gets the resources, who doesn't, who's deserving of being represented. And I was like, wow, white supremacy can exist without white people in the room. Patriarchy can exist without any male,
or female.
Yeah, you know what I mean? And then that for me created like, okay, I need to do the work, right? Like it can't always be about like reading The White Ally or like, you know what I mean? Like writing that essay to that one person who said something fucked up, but like figuring out how I also am like enacting these systems, because that's like how it works, right? Like people of color know how to like police each other better than any white person. You know what I mean? Like we already have, we know whiteness better than white people. You know what I mean? Like, we can tell you about it. So I think like for me, that's really important part of like the movement building is like understanding that. And especially when we're trying to build coalitions and solidarity and like working with multiple groups and like, that tension comes into the room because we didn't realize we brought all of our baggage in with us as well.
And what you're saying is true also about just like mainstream gay identity, how we're so good at policing ourselves to look masculine all the time, to attack masculine, to not attack, like be effeminate. And I think that's such a huge problem. And that's why, if you go on a date with a man and you tell him you're a feminist, the date's over. So, but that's a good thing. The self thing is just like really rigidity. It's the rigidity you're talking about, and this sort of idea of like really like liberating ourselves, which is just not happening, because like you said, like those questions of power are constantly like in your room, even when those actors are not there.
The word I was looking for, I just got it, internalized. Internalized sexism, internalized machism, internalized openness.
One of the things I think is interesting is that, Malic was really stressing the idea of prison abolition as like a sort of foundational thing. And I think one of the things that for me was a through line is the idea of living in a cognitive society versus a restorative one, and how that also links to being in an individualistic society versus a collective one, and like how those things kind of need each other, right? Like you have to create a hierarchy so that some people can rise to the top and kind of control everything, or access all the resources or whatever. And so I just think like how do we, and then I was thinking about sort of like the Michigan Women's Music Festival, and also like Camp Trans. Really easy name to remember, but I forgot it. But Camp Trans, which I've actually been to before, which is really cool, and outside of Michigan Women's Music Festival. But just thinking about like the ways in which we respond, and then also like what you were talking about, calling people out, and then what you were saying about love, and how that punitive society informs the way that we call each other out, and we kind of like push each other. We like say, "You fucked up and you're gone," or like you're kind of like dead to me, like versus like a restorative society, which might encourage us to be like, "You did something that hurt me, and like, but I want to coexist with you still." And like how that, like just like how can we embody that? I'm just sort of blabbing. I decided to become a panelist, so yes, transition into panelist. Yeah, so I just wanted to kind of add those thoughts to the conversation. Yeah, maybe we can open it up to our fellow panelists. Yeah.
Just kind of going off what you were saying there on this, like, as these movements become more visible and we are become, these super inclusive spaces, how do we keep those spaces inclusive but also safe for people to do their work and not put all of that kind of like restorative work on I guess just like eliminating that burnout of like, I really don't want to explain to you one more time, this principle because, I can't, like, I don't have the capacity to do that. Like, how do we avoid that? And how do we keep inclusive spaces safe for everyone?
I have a question, but for everyone. I love that, queer community, we always talk about safe space. I wonder what safety is. Because I was at this talk this last week called Beyond 1 Billion Rising, and they were talking about like restorative justice and like bullying and like how there are all these laws now for like online bullying and that sort of thing. But like what is bullying, and like what is being treated unfairly, and like what does that mean culturally? So for example, one of the panelists who's a Black woman said, the way in which I deal with conflict culturally, right? It's like if I have something to say to Sia about something that, like we had a situation, I'll say it to your face, right? Because saying it behind your back would be the biggest insult. That would be horrible, right? But in some cases, doing that is confrontational, you're aggressive, you're rude, that you're bullying me, right? So like in safe space within the queer community, sometimes I'm interested in like what that would look like. Because some people would find that upsetting, right? I've had many encounters with like white allies where I've been like, I don't care about your tears, right? Like as an ally, right? Like one, you can't tell me you're supporting me if I'm expressing my experiences and you can't take it. Mm-hmm. Your feelings are hurt. Am I abusive? Is my language abusive? They may feel unsafe in that situation, but how do we build solidarity if I can't express? You know what I mean? I'm interested in like kind of talking about like what safety may look like in a community where we're holding each other accountable.
What I heard from the question was like, how do I function at my job without having to tell you what you're doing wrong all the time? Am I right? So what you were saying, like the idea of safer space or safe space, like what is that? Yeah, like what does that look like? For all of us in our different endeavors and.
Well, I mean, I think this is a question I've been trying to articulate because I do something that bills itself as a safe, it used to bill itself as a safe space and now as a safer space. Language changes constantly, which is good. It makes us more intentional. I think like a safe space isn't a space where you can't call somebody out or you can't have like a really intense conversation. I think a safe space is where you aren't going to be I mean, I guess sometimes it's like a very subjective line or something, but I just feel like safe spaces where you're not going to be targeted, like where you're not going to be like targeted through violence of physical violence or violence of words, or you're not going to be policed to be a particular way. I think like a safe space is a place where you can take risks, be it with what you're wearing or like with what you're saying. But the contract is that you will do those things intentionally. And if you don't do those things intentionally, then you breach the contract, and then like the consequences are sort of like meted out by the community, But I really think that like a safe space needs to have as little authority, like central authority, and as much like collective. That said, there are, we live in a hierarchical world, and so there do need to be people that can be kind of on call to step in as sort of band-aid kind of authoritative figures, I think, to sort of like be allies or like whatever. I mean, I think it's complicated. It's like not pretty or sexy, but it's complex.
I don't know. I want to say that, like the question about taking the time to express, I think it's worth it, but I think there are times for the safer space where, there's that open communication, and then there are times for self-preservation and isolation to get a certain kind of work done, but it's just those two things don't exist at the same time. But I think in general, it's worth it, to have those conversations, even if they're tiring sometimes, but there's also times to protect oneself and do their own work. And in line with that, when we speak to what Nick was saying about doing your own work, like seeing that oppression is internalized, and so there can be no white people in the room, and you just could see and had that revelation. But I just want to say, as this kind of body and person, that it's just important. That's the whole thing. We have to take responsibility and do this work. I carry the oppression, like we all carry it. So how do we, move forward? Through making art, maybe. That's why we're here talking about that.
Word, and so like something that comes up for me and that came up for me, we talk about these things all the time. I just want to say I'm really proud to be your friend. But we talk about it all the time, which is like decolonizing the mind, right? So understanding that we live in a very fucked up society that has taught us all to hate blackness, that has taught us all to dismiss indigenous people, that has taught us all to be up with the masculine, down with the femme, right? So understanding that, accepting that, and then really asking yourself very difficult questions about, where you stand on these things. Why you grabbed your purse when a black man walked by, you know what I'm saying? But you're so progressive, right? So it's and not in a shameful way. So not me shaming you or not you shaming yourself. Guilt, we just talked about this at the train, but guilt is no good if there's no action afterwards, you know what I mean? Hold your tears, but make sure that guilt allows you to do a different thing the next time, be better the next time. So yeah, work.
But I guess that's a hard thing to do, right? You need hold that space and be called out or called in. I heard about that this week, that there's two different types of calling somebody, but I guess how does the community help you afterwards? And I think that's what I got from the conversation about at 1 billion, Beyond 1 Billion Rising, is that if you call someone out, call someone in with love, right, then it is also a responsibility as a person in the community to engulf that person and be able to support them. So it's not me just reading Latham about, say, something that happened at Chances and whisking off and never showing up again. That's not accountability, that's not community, but doing the work to talk to someone about it, to call them out, to create that safe space, and then maintaining that bond. And I think that's something that doesn't happen a lot, whether it be whether you're going to Mishfest and doing that, sort of calling out and then disappearing and not showing up. It's what's the use of doing that, of being that interruption and then not working to repair?
I also want to look at how the burden of that is often I don't want it to be people of color have to have the burden of making much as like, if someone's gonna call me out, they wanted to like walk me through that, I would like receive that with so much gift, but I didn't think that would be so valuable. I don't think it's always that person's responsibility.
Yeah, I agree as well. I think that like, especially, I mean, this kind of reminds me of like the whole calling in conversation. I do agree with to an extent, but I think that also within this like queer bubble, we get like very over things really quickly, and half people don't know what calling out means yet. You know, so I'm not sure if we can, like, I do agree with approaching people with love in general as like a really like beautiful sentiment, but at the, like, there's also moments where I think that letting people know what's going on and not necessarily with all that's going on in my life, being there to work them through that. I'm not sure if, like, again, I feel that oftentimes that responsibility does fall on people of color. So I think there's this idea of doing work with yourself, especially as a white a person who's working towards allyship, is really, really important. And
But I feel like for me, what I learned about the calling in and calling out is the difference between like, I'll call someone out, right? But like calling someone out would be not necessarily like, I don't have to do the steps, I don't have to do anything. It's just like me speaking to it. I would say, for example, if we're in a group together and we're building something and there's like something that happens, a situation, I would call in to somebody who I'm in a relationship with that is important to base build and movement making. So I think I didn't necessarily explain the difference, but I think for me that created like an autonomy of like, yes, I don't need to help, you know, the white girl who I made cry because she deserved it, and like I needed to I needed to just like let her know that it wasn't okay. But Sia, you know, me and her like creating work together, and like I'm gonna call in and I'm gonna also make sure that I follow up.
Yeah,
so I think it for me created like an autonomy, like yes, okay, cool, I don't need to follow up with that person who I don't even really want to build anything with.
I also like using that word autonomy because it means that you don't even have to, and calling in, it's the first time I heard it, but it means that you don't have to necessarily agree with the people that are your partners. And that's like, that's some of the, maybe the potential for, you were talking about like a longevity of like, well, how can not, it has to be able to be flexible. I think part of that could be that people have the autonomy to be like working closely and then having these things that they are understanding and working through now. And that's like kind of new to me, just at this moment. It's like,
I think I don't know if I understood what you're saying, but I think of like two words in the art world, kind of taboo, and one is love for the other, and the other one is beauty, right? We cannot talk about that, right? You say beauty, but you know, they're beautiful. I think confrontation can come out of love, and not out of hatred. And I think that's the positive angle that I want to project. And if I question, where am I coming from? I am coming from an authority because I'm white, or I'm coming from your authority because you're black. And so those questions are for me critical, right? And I would criticize anybody who still holds to the values of, you know, shifting. It's like the two sides of the same coin. I feel, and this doesn't come, it comes from some kind of theory, you know, like we internalize the oppressor, we internalize the white man or the white woman, and when we get rid of those values, then it's very possible that we turn the coin around and we begin to apply those values against the other. So it's like, you know, a reverse up, because we still haven't completely got rid of the structures that are internalized. And this is a total utopian, you know, not utopian, but I hope for that against dystopia, right?
So I love what you said, Silvia, about confronting out of love. And I feel like sometimes, you know, maybe it has something to do with the cue of taking on a cue of speaking up. And I keep thinking about Fred's anecdote of taking off the footage of the film. And I mean, it's kind of like the things that we edit out, that we miss that cue. And I for some part of me wants you to bring that footage forward, you know, and I don't know if that's a revisionist act, but it feels more like a taking on the cue, even if it's 10 years later. Because I know that when you say, Silvia, about confronting out of love, or sometimes I feel like I didn't speak up and my self-love suffered.
Right,
Yeah.
yeah, and that's the other thing.
What's the importance of language in these issues? It seems like I think about words a lot, especially as a bilingual person, like thinking about what language means and how we use it and how it can be sort of more oppressive, certain words, and but what is really, when we're talking about feminism or queerness or justice and all these sort of issues, like what's your take on language, words?
Personally, for me, I find when we have conversations about this all the time, I find a lot of the language we use when talking about things within the community kind of isolating, and like will oftentimes meaning become so abstracted because we'll say, okay, I can't talk to you right now because I have to go process, or like that's something. Like there's a lot of, or I'm gonna like I totally called him out. Like what does that mean? Like I'm not sure, and like I'll like be like, I don't know what you're saying, even though I can kind of get it. I'll just like, I have no idea what that means, and then I'll say, I don't know what you're saying. And then we'll break it down like what happened today, instead of like relying on this language. And it sounds really small, but I think it's really, really important. Or like instead of me having to check someone, what does that mean? What does it mean to check someone? You know what I mean? And I was in this really cool party that's in a safe space. What does that mean? What does that mean? What are we talking about? And so I'm so thankful for that question, because I think that we really, language unites us, but again, like this idea of like unifying and leaving out, like I would really, really like to encourage more conversations that aren't relying on these words that are becoming easier and easier to fall back on, because they leave a lot of people out who aren't hip to the lingo, you know, and then also reduce the meaning of what we're saying into quick and easy digestible phrases. And so I'm also a word person too, mainly a writer first, so that's something I think is really important.
I think words are important, but they confuse me a lot. I'm not like a writer, I'm like more of a mover, you know, and like that's like how I understand, and like I think a lot of times I like am at talks and stuff, and I like feel really unsmart, you know, because I'm like, oh man, like writing down my notes, I'm like, what was that word, like what did that mean? And I think that also has been my entry point into feminism. I'm like, ooh, like I don't get it, like how does that work? How does that like work with my life? So I feel like a lot of times I have to ask a lot of questions, and if like I'm not brave enough, I just exit the conversation. And it's another piece of being hip to the lingo. Yeah. It's like, what do you really mean? Yeah, but I feel like it's useful, right? Like, you know, to say prison industrial complex, it like kind of sums it up. But then it's always great when that one person explains a little bit about like what that means. You know what I mean? It's like when you're talking, it's easier to use acronyms and stuff. But then if you don't understand them.
Because I'm just even thinking about the issue of pronouns and how I've stopped myself sometimes from communicating with someone because I didn't know which one to use. So instead of trying to have a conversation, then I remain silent. So there's no, then it becomes, you know what I mean? It cuts everything, because I just, you want to be careful with the words that you choose, so you choose not to use it.
In that case specifically, this is not broad, but I would just suggest using their name, the person's name. That's like just super specific, but as like a strategy, I would just use their name.
I also like, it's awkward at first, but like when you just get into practice of being like, oh, by the way, like what pronouns do you use? And I think like, because I think what you don't want it to do is like be the thing that you're thinking about when you're having a conversation with another human being. Like, it's like, what is your gender? What is your gender? I can't even hear you because I don't know how to and like, I think we've like talked to that a little bit. So I think like, you know, getting into practice of like asking the question, but maybe not it being the first question. Like maybe it'd be the second, third, fourth, or even like an email later. Like, hey, that was a great conversation. Like, by the way, like, how should I refer to you? Like, discuss what a great conversation we had with other people, you know what I mean? Like,
But the thing about it is that I have had a lot of people come up to me and like are like fearful, right? Because I feel like there's also a lot of shaming around gender and like gender pronouns that we have to like talk about openly. So I've had people be like, "Thank you so much for working with me. I'm so sorry. Like I don't mean to like mispronounce." And I'm like, "Girl, it's okay. It's a journey. Like for me, it's a journey. Like I didn't just wake up one day and like understand trans identity and the difference between gender and sexuality. Like it took a really long time. So I feel like a lot of people are also really afraid, and I like definitely like thank you for asking that, because I know for sure it's not an easy thing just to be like, oh, hold on a second, what are your gender pronouns?
Right,
You know what I mean?
yeah.
So like I think it's also something that someone in the community that I always say, like, you know, it's a process. If we know each other for like 6 months and this is still happening, I'm gonna check you on it. But for now, like, you know, take your time and like it's okay, because it sucks to not be able to talk to someone. You know what I mean?
Yeah, but I'm saying even if, like, for example, you didn't get the pronoun, the person's gender identity is definitely important. But calling someone by their name and acknowledging them as a person in the stead, you know, kind of.
No, I mean, it was more an analogy of how language can be a barrier to communication.
I want to ask something. Isn't the difficulty of putting the pronoun when they're talking, not one-to-one, but when talking in the third person, that's
the toughest.
think,
Yeah, that's the toughest.
yeah,
Yeah.
Mhm. But, I mean, when you talk you and me,
Yeah.
you know, there is no gender there. There is you and me. The problem comes when we have to talk about the other. Yeah?
or when
And
it's
the
you,
struggle.
that person, and then the
No,
other person, and you're like,
right.
and what
This is my
Exactly.
friend.
said,
They.
whatever said.
Yeah.
Right,
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, maybe that's also like, that's one of the things where like the safe space become problematic, right? Because we want to be so safe and we don't want to hurt anyone that we're not going to say anything and then we're not going to have a conversation. We have to check ourselves on that, you know, and like the over-policing and all of those things. I think it's important to just.
Totally. Well, I think what you're saying like makes me think of what Brooks was saying earlier, and other people have been saying about the idea that we're all in process, right?
Yeah.
And so we're all in process of unlearning and undoing these like harmful structural things. And that's what a safer space is also, right? It's like a collective undoing of like harmful like structural things that we're trying to break free from in this like autonomous moment, like and as much as possible. And of course we can never totally break out of that. We're still going to exist in capitalism in America and like patriarchy, white supremacy, blah 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 blah. But like commercialism, like whatever it is, like but like we can at least like collectively try to be in this process of like doing those like structural damaging things, you know.
And it is through the voice. It is through the voice embodied, I think, and in the work we do.
Yeah.
Right? And it's always acknowledging the transformation, the process, which I think I said before, that when we try to fix something, we don't acknowledge reality as a process. And, you know, I'm used to it too.
I feel like for me, working on my artist statement was like a really great like process of this, you know, like sitting down and figuring out, and also my bio, like how I was going to talk about myself as an artist and like how I could talk about like my identity as it like refers to my work. I don't know like how, like what you guys' experiences for me is, but I just kept thinking about like how I wanted like my body of work to be framed and like for like to talk about myself. And I think the first time I used gender neutral pronouns on paper was like my artist bio and like my artist statement. And for me it was like such a powerful thing to see on paper like my name change and like how I wanted to be seen. It was like such a declaration of like self like actualization. It felt so amazing, you know what I mean? And then to see like that happen in like other ways, and then also by doing that and then not having people refer to me after seeing that and like seeing my work, it created more of a division of like, oh, you don't want to see me the way in which I'm like presented.
Yeah? Wait, what? Oh, sorry.
Either way.
Hi.
Hi, just a few comments. Thinking about language, and one thing I remember, old enough to remember this, is when the word "Ms." was introduced, and everybody thought it was the weirdest thing, and now it's sort of like super old school, and nobody really thinks about it anymore. I also have a daughter who had a trans partner, and I found myself having to explain or being asked things and having to confront the thing about being exhausted by this process all the time, where people would ask me about her and her partner, and the first thing they would ask me about was about their sex life. And I would say, I would try to just kind of hand the bag back to them and say, I don't really ask you about, your daughter's sex life. Why do you think that's okay? Let's have a conversation. I didn't want to keep having that conversation, but I felt like, just to the point of, it never sort of ends, the work never ends, and I feel it across kind of all levels and spectrums of my life, even from being a feminist and working with Feminist Gallery for many, many years, and looking at the politics of where the gallery has evolved and trying to reframe the language instead of about inclusion, it's about dialogue and access across platforms and opening our space so that our space can change and all those kind of things. I think that I'm realizing is that will never stop, and it's always going to evolve. And so to the point of having to just take some time to rest sometimes on those things and regroup because it's really important for me. But I also want to add just a little positive piece on sort of a long-term perspective, and I just love this panel so much. But I've also been at the College Art Association panels the last couple of days, and one of the things I've noticed is how many more panels are talking about these subjects. That never used to happen. So that's something that is actually moving, and maybe it's not moving at the the pace that we all want, but I can really see some changes happening, and lots of different kinds of bodies in these spaces that didn't used to happen. So not that that's a summation, but that's just an observation of one piece. I'm both hopeful, but also recognizing that my own vigilance around these things and my self-examination of how I approach things and self-critique around them, it's work I will always do from personal to how my actions are in the work.
Are we at time, or do
Do we have time?
we have
More
time?
questions?
Great.
I
Want to get an audience member to take a picture?
Or if let's
check in.
panelists have any final remarks they'd like to make?
Yeah.
It sort of relates, and it's kind of a comment, maybe question. Something that I find is that a lot of times it's hard to decide. You were talking about sex work, and it's hard to say, if you say that sex work is bad, are you then putting down women? And I think that that's like a common misconception when you talk about sex work, because a lot of the reason that women are in sex work is because they need the money and they have no other choices. So I just think it's kind of an important conversation where the blame is, I guess. I don't know if that makes sense, but
I'm not exactly sure. Can you rephrase it?
So the idea that sex work is okay and should be decriminalized, I think sometimes it can be looked at as, oh, that's because I'm trying to empower women and they have their own agency. But I think, at least in my opinion, they don't have agency, because to me, sex work is not liberating. A lot of women are used, killed, even raped. So I just think it's an important thing. Like, it's difficult for me to decide when I'm saying something that's going to help women and when I'm saying something that might look as though I'm not a feminist, or I'm not, does that make sense?
Yeah,
You go ahead.
Well, one thing for me when it comes to that is like, I think this idea of, well, what I was hearing you saying, that helps me. There's this idea of helping women, and this kind of idea of categorization and like having to unify women in general is really tough. Like, I think that what is important about the decriminalization of sex work is that, of course, like, I'm not going to blanket everything and say we're all just like really radical, like sex positive people doing it, like, whatever is on the side just for fun. Like, that's not how it is. But I believe the person and the woman should have the ability and should be given the autonomy to make that decision for herself. And I don't want to believe that I know any sort of blanketing thing that can help women. Like, I don't even know what that means, like help women means. But what I do know would help women would not having so many people in jail and like not having like crazy fines. I think in Illinois, it's the third time you're arrested. It's like how many years is it? It's like I want to say over 10 years and a felony.
And
you can't
some
vote.
states,
Like that's to me the problem. I know that helps women. If I take away that part, I know at the very least that's helping women.
And in some states, they're starting to like put some work in around like being a sexual offender, like after some point, which like obviously, I'm always into like not making any more laws. I feel like we have enough laws to protect people, right? So like, it's illegal to steal or kidnap someone. It's illegal to punch someone in the face, right? So all of the horrible violence.
We could operate off of those laws as opposed to policing sexual activity. I think that like the worst part of a lot of the but the worst part about a lot of the kind of persecution, I'd say almost a witch hunt of like sex workers, is that we're persecuting the sexual act when it's not. All the bad things, in my opinion, are not usually focused around the sexual act. It's around the violence. It's around trafficking. It's around power dynamics. It's around a lot of different things other than just like working it out and making your money. Like that's
yeah, and I think a lot of it also has to do with like this sort of like morality talk that I feel like we like don't like to talk about, or like someone described it as something else, but like something politics. But it's like at the end of the day, it's like not morality politics, but like I don't know, something to do with like being a good person. But anyway, I just feel like like I'm just interested in confronting that. I feel like as I talk to like more like conservative LGBT people, I just want them to name it. Like you have an issue with it because it's a moral thing for you. It's not about like protecting women. It's a moral thing for you. And like honestly, I'm not interested in anyone else's definitions of morality.
I have just one thing to contribute, which is there's the book Yes Means Yes, edited by Jessica Valenti and another person. But there's one of the essays in there, it's written by a sex worker. And what I took away from it was so interesting because it was the sex worker was talking about consent. And what the essay really was saying was that this sex worker felt that they had more consent in their work than they did with their lovers.
Yes, that's true.
It's because it was more clear. That exchange of money made it more clear of what they were wanting out of that interaction than with their lovers. So to me, I don't know, I think that's one of the things that helped me start, because I don't know, I feel like.
Right, and I was not saying anything morally, like where I'm like, oh, these women are immoral, and my thing was just that, I don't know, I guess I feel like focusing on that is maybe not the right thing to focus on. I'm more interested in why these women have to do these things. And I don't know, I know that like a lot of people don't agree with me, but I think that we don't have as much agency or consent as we think we do.
Yeah, again, though, just wrapping up quickly, though, I think that the idea then is women don't have enough money, we're not getting enough money for food, basic resources, healthcare. So let's look at food, basic resources, healthcare instead of the sex work. That would be right.
Yeah, because I agree with you, and I think.
Yeah, I agree too.
But I feel like the conversation always leads into this like trap of morality,
well, let's talk about food.
And human trafficking, and it doesn't go into like what do we need to have all of the options so that I can like maybe have a 9 to 5 and do sex work if I want to. You know what I mean? So like, how can we like?
Or not do sex work if you absolutely don't
exactly
want to. And I think that's real where you're coming from. Like, there are people that do sex work that would rather not.
Yeah.
And we need to we definitely need to advocate for them, but I think what people are saying is that in their kind of experience or understanding of the issues, is that policing doesn't do that, it does the opposite. So how do we kind of go to something else, But it's great, I think what's great is that we're all concerned for the people who are doing sex work, so maybe that's where we keep the focus. I think we are supposed to wrap it up.
Sure.
This was final remarks.
Final remarks.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you guys for coming out
Yeah.
today.
So the conversation just continues in a different format, which is amongst us, in the world, and while we are in the world. So there
And
we go.
can I just say as like a closing, huge thanks to Latham for agreeing to moderate this panel, and Silvia and Amina and Daviel and Fred and Jillian and Malic for participating.